going to talk about the Robo debt collection scheme. I'm going to first, I'll put it in a context of attacks on the poor and attacks on welfare recipients. I'll look a little bit at that in terms of a little bit of history, and I'm also going to look at questions about the social construction and stigmatization of welfare recipients, and I'll also be looking at some of the actual figures to do with the Robo debt collection. I will be asking, why did governments run negative and indeed venomous campaigns against welfare recipients? And it's been going along and been happening for quite some time. Indeed, some have talked about it's not a war on poverty, it's a war on the poor. The consistent attacks on welfare recipients, on often the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our society. Why the labelling? Why the stigma? Why might this happen? Just really quickly, in terms of a potted history, this type of thing has been happening since at least the Elizabethan poor laws. That principle of less eligibility in the poor laws, the notion that benefit levels and charity should always be pegged below, lower than the lowest wages in society. So that notion of less eligibility has been around since the Elizabethan poor laws. And with that, desert, whether people deserve to be assisted, their worth and their character as human beings is often under scrutiny. And the setting of conditions and making sure the conditions are not good for the poor and the needy. In the poorhouse, the workhouse, the flop house, the conditions were degrading, unpleasant, and made so deliberately so as not to encourage pauperism, reliance on, as it was put, handouts. And yes, that is the notion of the framing, I think, of the Elizabethan poor laws and why they had that flavour of punishing the poor even back then. Let's jump now to the establishment of the welfare state historically in England, Beveridge, and even Churchill himself, certainly not against a government welfare system. But Beveridge, certainly, and Churchill made one key point, a sticking point, that such government systems of welfare should not encourage pauperism, people to rely on welfare. That must be discouraged. In the modern day, in our time, in your time, a campaign, I think, is a benchmark, was the so-called anti-Dole bludger campaigns of the Fraser government back in the 1970s and into the 80s. I'll just mention in passing in this potted historical account 2 pieces of research that I carried out on the abuse, the attacks, the campaigns against dole recipients. I carried out a piece of research on a data set, the financial year 1974-75 to the financial year 1977-1978, and I carried out another piece of research a bit later from 1980-81 to 1985-86. So I have 2 data sets. And I found as follows in both of those studies, that unemployment benefit fraud and also the so-called fraud of the supporting parents benefit was firstly very low, always low, consistently low. For example, the convictions compared to the total beneficiaries is as follows. Never more than a single percent of welfare recipients were convicted. Indeed, in terms of the unemployment benefits, 0.03 to 0.26. That's never even 1% of recipients were convicted of fraud. And similarly, with supporting parents benefits, the convictions to beneficiaries across that 1980, 81, 85, 86 data set, 0.13 to 0.19%. 0.1%, not 1%, 1/10. And from those two pieces of research, I draw the following conclusions. Firstly, that welfare fraud, for all the attacks made on welfare recipients, the Dole Bludger campaign and so forth, the attacks on single parents, supporting parents, welfare fraud, the fraud of the system, was never high. It was consistently low, and the amount of money recovered was trivial compared to the overall amount of money spent on the benefits, and the amount of money involved in the fraud was trivial compared to the amount of money it cost to pursue so-called fraud. Pursuing so-called fraud, but back then, meant the so-called field inspectors, and it also meant, I'll call them what we called them. In England, they were called semen sniffers. They would go into single parents, households, people claiming the supporting parent benefit, just to check if there was a man living with them, pulling back bed sheets and so forth. But the costs of that, policing so-called fraud, and I'm starting to call it so-called fraud now because we're talking about such a small percentage of people who were convicted and indeed who were in any way ripping off the system, consistently low, and always consistently low in relation to the massive amount of money caught up in tax cheating, tax evasion, and what is more, in tax foregone. That is to say, and there was a lovely ad in the newspapers last week by a firm called BT. They were saying, and I actually passed it on to my students as a joke, that you've only got a few days left by which you can put $540,000 in your superannuation and only attract the concession rate of 15%. If you've got 540,000 and up to that point. And secondly, the money that is foregone in what some people would call Peter Costello's middle-class welfare. And I hope I'm not hurting anybody's fingers, but it does apply to me too, feeling something, but it applies to me. No tax on superannuation withdrawals. Now, be that as it may, it's very difficult to claim, as the government does, that the apocalyptic demography, the demographic time bomb of an aging population, when, if you add up the money the government loses with the concessional rate of 15% of people putting income into their superannuation and the tax foregone by not taxing withdrawals, that is so close to the amount of money spent on the welfare benefits themselves, and will increase, of course, if those benefits are left there, those tax concessions. And so the notion that we're facing an apocalypse, a demographic apocalypse, a demographic time bomb, doesn't seem to hold good if we can show that the amount of money the government could be spending on welfare would be very close to being that, on the age pension, I should say, that which the government is foregoing. Let's have a look now at Robo debt. Let's give it its right name: online compliance intervention. Online compliance intervention. But before I pursue that in a bit of depth, I want to make a distinction about two kinds of rhetorics in the attacks on welfare and welfare recipients and the welfare state. One, I've already indicated, is this notion of a welfare state that's unsustainable. We can't support the welfare state going forward. And that will be along the lines of the terms that I've used, because these are the technical terms: demographic time bomb, apocalyptic demography. And that is the case. It is an attack on the welfare state. It's an attack on the elderly, but it's slightly more genteel than the attacks on unemployed and on supporting parents and so forth. Because there's another kind of attack on the welfare state rhetoric. And I call it a more hard-edged, punitive approach, cracking down on fraud and doing it with labeling, terms like, and this was from a minister under the Fraser government, the cool young who think it's fun to be dole bludging. That kind of rhetoric, that harsher-edged attacks on the welfare state and welfare recipients. So let's have a look at what Robo debt is, the online compliance intervention. Or put another way, if I may borrow from, paraphrase Bruce Willis, the SOP on OCI is as follows. Its rationale we can get from what the government said. We're going to scrap manual checking. And by that, the government means they gather information from the ATO and match it with information supplied by welfare recipients to look for what are called discrepancies. Discrepancies in what the person has said they have been doing in terms of work or not able to work and what they've been claiming. And that used to be done manually, checking for discrepancies. Compare ATO, Australian tax information, with Centrelink data. And that was done typically by a letter telling people that there was a discrepancy and that they needed to do something about it. But now, what the government has at its disposal, able to use in attacks on welfare recipients, is modern online data processing. Now, you hear from time to time, and maybe for some it's a red badge of courage and others not, somebody has been dumped by their long-term partner by text. And in an earlier, more literary time, perhaps it would have been a letter, a Dear John letter. But these days people do, their partners will say to them, it's all over and it's by text. Well, that is a means available to us, but it's a hard way to do it to someone. It's treating someone with less than dignity. It's making it very clear you don't care about them. Yes, the technology's there, but you really want to do it that brutal way. And that technology, in a very sophisticated form, is available to the government. And they're seeking to match the ATO data, Australian Tax Office data, with the Centrelink data. And they send out what's called a discrepancy letter, or as Pauline Hanson would call it, a please explain letter. And that the person must reply in 21 days. If they don't reply, the following happens. They attract a debt recovery penalty of 10% of the debt. They're told they owe the government a debt, and their benefits are in jeopardy. The government has a rationale for that. Firstly, in terms of the numbers it can target these days. When it was done manually, that notion of picking up of the discrepancy between the tax office and Centrelink data, around 20,000 compliance intervention notices were sent out per year, hard copy, letter, snail mail, about 20,000 a year. And that brought the government back in around 295,000 a year, call it 300,000. So 20,000 compliance letters a year, bringing in, roughly speaking, $300,000, as they say, raised in debts. But with this new scheme, the Robo debt, the online compliance intervention, they're now able to do, and this is the words of Minister Tudge, they can do 20,000 compliance interventions a week. And indeed, they propose over 3 years to send out 1.7 million of these compliance notices. And they believe that'll be worth, and I haven't done my homework, I should have done the calculation, it'll bring in, the minister said, $4.5 million a day. But hang on, I mean, let's take the figures at face value. Do they mean tomorrow and the day after and next month, every day and the year after that? I mean, will it come to an end? Otherwise, they'll end up recovering at 4.5, more than they actually spend. But that is their promise. That is the promise. So we'll be able to, not 20,000 a year we'll be able to send out of these notices, but rather we'll do 20,000 a week. What effect did that have on the people receiving those notices, those compliance notices? Sorry? Oh, I would think so, and worse, yeah. Well, first, it's worth pointing out, because it was such a poo fight, that there was an inquiry with the Commonwealth Ombudsman into what was going on, and that found 1 in 5 receiving a letter had no debt. 1 in 5 had no debt whatsoever, but they got the letter with all of that impact on them. But it also means that 4 in 5 did have, well, we can't say a debt, but we can say that there was a discrepancy, and that was to be followed up. The Commonwealth does have the power to transform a statement about money owing straight away into a debt, and indeed we know the government, with the Robo debt scheme, sent out mercantile money recoverers, debt recovery people, to chase people up. Sorry. I thought something. No, you're right. Now, there are problems, massive problems, with this scheme. One of them was, and if anybody here has ever had any dealings with Centrelink and Centrelink on the phone, the fact that the government screwed up those letters and in many cases had the wrong phone number on it, sending people to Centrelink, not to the debt recovery mob, and so they had to listen to that music, or that if you've ever been on hold with Centrelink, that music. I mean, it's classical music, it's nice. But if you're waiting 20 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, and you give up the conducting and whatever, it's ghastly. Okay. So this massive confusion and the waiting on the phone and being told, no, this is the wrong department to deal with that. Next, for me, the impact was hardest on the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our community. The most vulnerable and disadvantaged, those least able to obtain the work income information they needed to send in. They had to chase up with previous employers how much they'd earned and when they'd been employed and so forth. And we know in what Guy Standing has called precarious work, many people who are on welfare, off welfare, in work, on welfare again, off welfare, in work, it is what is called precarious work. No job security, no front-end benefits like holiday pay and so forth, very low paid, low security, at the mercy of a boss who rings up and says, oh, look, I need you to come in for a shift this afternoon. Oh dear, I can't. Well, look, if you can't make it, I'll get somebody else. Don't bother turning up again. So very often, the people who are hammered by this were those through non-English speaking backgrounds or various cognitive difficulties, cognitive impairments, very, very poorly placed, with confusion, and the point made before, deep anxiety, being hit with a debt and told you have a debt and your benefits will be cut off. You now have more debt than you had. You need a payment plan. So often, not people who are particularly able to navigate the system. That's the immediate effects, the human effects, the human toll, the effects on people who are caught up in this. Well, we've got the means, let's throw the dragnet around and drag them all in, no matter what the effect on human beings. But it had some other effects, and I think they're important, but they're negative and very negative. They were about the publicity. And my concern would be that that kind of publicity would reinforce public perceptions of welfare fraud as serious and widespread. Now, I'm relying now on my own research back 20 years or so now, but welfare fraud then, and I would think now, is not at a high level. It's consistently, always at a low level, say the percentage of convictions to actual beneficiaries. Not even half of 1%. But that publicity emphasizes the stereotypes and the stigma around welfare and welfare fraud. It reinforces, is likely to reinforce, negative views of welfare recipients. Let me sum up, please. But rather than actually just providing a summary, I want to move to this question: why do we have these negative campaigns? Why do we have the attacks on welfare recipients. Why should that be? Their frequent moral panics, their campaigns against the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. There tends to be three main explanations people reach for, or at least two, and I think there is a third. And typically, as an academic, I guess if there's three and they're separate, maybe they could be all run together and that'd be four. But we'll just deal with the three. The following have been advanced to explain why these attacks on the most needy, the most vulnerable. Typically, there's an argument, a deliberate, conscious conspiracy by governments to deflect attention from their failings, the problems that they have, the problems of the day, or longer-term problems, a failure to grapple with deep-seated, entrenched poverty. The notion then that it's a deliberate ruling class conspiracy to deflect attention by governments from the failures of a government to deal with inequality and other forms of disadvantage, class, gender, race, ethnicity. Secondly, not a conspiracy, but deliberate, but more opportunistic. These attacks on the poor and needy, on welfare recipients, are not part of a deliberate conspiracy, but rather when an opportunity presents itself to the government of the day. The government, in other words, takes advantage of a set of circumstances, again, to deflect attention from it and its shortcomings and its problems. So then, the notion then, I put the first 2 points under deflect attention from government failings. Deliberate attempts to deflect attention. I think that's amounting to a conspiracy. And secondly, opportunistic. There's a third approach. Oh, I'm going too long. Yeah, I beg your pardon. Sorry. Okay, look, I'll just wind up now. I was saying there was a couple of reasons why we get these campaigns. One of them is deflecting attention deliberately. Another one is opportunistically. And thirdly, there's, I call it mean-spiritedness or bloody-mindedness. And you'll love this one. Do you remember Eysenck, the psychologist we used to love to hate, right-wing Eysenck? Yeah. He argues that there are two dimensions in the politics of, in the psychology of politics. One is, we all know, a left-right dimension, and we know how people may or may not square up on that. But he said there's a second orthogonal or separate dimension. Knowing where one is on one of the dimensions doesn't predict the other. And the other dimension he calls tough-minded, tender-minded. So when we look at a human being, another person, somebody perhaps begging on the street, a person lining up with us in Centrelink, do we see a human being, another human being, or do we see a category? Do we see a stereotype? Do we see a stigmatized category? Not a real person. Do we just see the myths of the Dole bludger? Just one final point, please. And it is this. What I think goes on, and I think, yes, the French social theorist Foucault would put us in this direction. It's the notion that it's a process of stigmatization by one identifying something, even though in the very act of apparently identifying something, we construct it. In other words, there isn't the problem out there. We make the problem by categorizing it and putting a label on it. But that's the first step, identifying a real or imagined problem and we socially construct it, we stigmatize, we stereotype. That by stereotype I mean the one-sided negative attribution of traits. You don't hear nice things about welfare recipients. And so it's up to you, make up your mind, is it a deliberate conspiracy that governments do it, or is it opportunistic, or is it mean-spiritedness, or is it all a bit of all of those together? Thanks. Sorry.